Okay, welcome everybody to the Northeast Philadelphia History Network. We're sponsored by the Friends of Northeast Philadelphia History, and I am Jack McCarthy. I'm the president of the Friends of Northeast Philadelphia History, and we put on these monthly meetings. I think most of you are previous attendees. Do we have any new people tonight? No? You're new? Okay, we got a new person. So we have these meetings the first Wednesday of every month. We've been doing it for like 12 years on topics on local history. The way we communicate is through our email list, and we're going to be passing around a sign-in sheet, so put your email on there, or through our Facebook page, the the Northeast Philadelphia History Network Facebook page. Those are the two ways that we communicate with our group. A couple of things. So we generally have a site visit we meet the first Wednesday of every month, except for July and August. And our June meeting is usually a site visit somewhere. And so if any of you remember, last June, we were going to meet at the new GAR Civil War Museum and Library in Holmesburg. They moved from their original location in Frankfurt to Holmesburg. If you remember, there were wildfires in Canada a year ago, and it was just like too unhealthy to go out. And the way we had to do it is a bunch of people would have to stand out in the garden while the first group of people toured through the museum. So we just decided to cancel that meeting for safety reasons. So we're now rescheduling it. Hopefully there won't be any other natural disasters. But the first Wednesday in June, we will be not meeting here, but we will be touring the Civil War Museum and Library in Holmesburg. Again, we'll send out information on our email listserv and on our Facebook page. So that's the next meeting. Many of you, I assume, were at our history fair in mid-April, which was a huge success. Thanks to everybody who came out. We had like 30-some presenting organizations and presentations, and hundreds of people showed up. So it was a great success. We do that every other year. So we will do that in the spring of 2026. That'll be the semi-quincentennial. I can always have trouble remembering the 250th anniversary of the nation. So again, we will meet on June 5th, the first Wednesday of June, at the GAR Museum. You'll receive notices about that. Then we're going to take off for July and August, and we'll start our meetings back up here in September. So a few sort of ground rules for the meeting. Everybody out in Zoom land, please stay muted and put your questions in the chat box on the Zoom, and then we will ask them at the end. We'll read them through the microphone, and then we will alternate reading ones from the online audience with questions in the house. We'll hand the microphone to everybody. Our talks are all recorded and put on our YouTube channel, the Northeast Philadelphia History Network YouTube channel. So you can see all our talks there, and tonight's talk as well. Those in person here, please stay around for desserts and socializing afterwards. And we'll get on with tonight's program. Suzin Weber is the Assistant Chief of the Central Public Services. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I get that right? Yeah, Central Public Services Division of the Parkway Central Library downtown. But before that, she was the librarian at the Tacony Library, and she got very interested in this topic, the Tacony Keystone Scientific and Literary Association, and she's going to give her talk tonight on that. And she's also studying for her doctorate in organizational leadership, so she's a true scholar. So this is a fascinating topic. Tacony has an amazing history. This is another aspect of it. So, Suzin?
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you for having me here. So we're going to talk tonight about the history of the Keystone Scientific and Literary Association. The Keystone Scientific and Literary Association was established in Tacony in 1876. It existed for 30 years and eventually transformed into the Tacony branch of the Free Library of Philadelphia, which opened in 1906. The source of most of the information that I have for this presentation tonight is a 2-bound volume set of the minutes of the Keystone Scientific and Literary Association, which resides in the historical collection at the Tacony branch of the Free Library of Philadelphia. It is available if anybody wanted to go down there and request the opportunity to view it. You can look through it. It's a fascinating read. It is written in very, very precise 19th century script. So be sure to bring your reading glasses and bring your patience, because some of the writing is very, very flowery, and it is very fascinating to deal with. So I have very much enjoyed my exposure to the Keystone Scientific and Literary Association, and I hope you will find it very interesting as well. So we begin in 1876. In 1876, the United States of America celebrated its centennial. Philadelphia hosted the Centennial International Exposition of 1876, recognized as the first official World's Fair held in America. The exposition was a showcase of American invention and ingenuity, highlighting the thinking of the Gilded Age in this country. In Tacony in the 1870s, saw magnate and industrialist Henry Diston was busily developing both the saw works along the river and a community around it to house and support his factory employees. In 1876, work on the residential community began in earnest. According to T. Worcester Worrell, who some of you may be familiar with probably from other discussions in other meetings, T. Worcester Worrell was a leading educator in the Frankfort and Tacony area in the late 19th century and was chancellor of a couple of schools, particularly in Frankfort. But at this particular time, he also was the head of the Henry W. Dittman Consolidated School in Tacony. So according to T. Worcester Worrell, the idea for the Keystone Scientific and Literary Association originated with John H. Currier, who assembled 7 or 8 like-minded men for an organizational meeting on an unidentified date at a location referred to as the Old Schoolhouse. If you've read any of the late Charlie McCluskey's work, particularly around the early history of Tacony during the period of William Gatzmer, you'll have come across some descriptions of an old wood frame schoolhouse that had been constructed in the 1850s. And most likely this reference to the Old Schoolhouse is that wood frame building. Thomas Diston chaired the meeting, and Worrell was appointed secretary, charged to draft a constitution and bylaws, which were subsequently unanimously adopted. Temporary leadership of the organization was given to T. Worcester Worrell as the president, Taylor Gish as the vice president, Samuel Helverson as secretary, and Joseph Mills as treasurer. Now, what's interesting in the original document that was written at that time, credit for the founding of the organization goes to John H. Currier. However, later in a speech delivered by a woman named M. Louise Thomas at the Tacony Music Hall in 1888, she takes credit for the founding of the organization. And she in fact writes, I'm going to grab one of my books. I should say she actually said in a speech. Let me scroll through this for a minute. So this is the opening page of the minutes of the Keystone Scientific and Literary Association. And you can see it stated October 24th, 1876, and begins with a sketch, which is T. Worcester Worrell's beginning narrative of the founding of the organization. So now M. Louise Thomas states in a program that was held at the Tacony Music Hall that the idea for the Keystone Scientific and Literary Association originally came to her, and she went to John H. Currier, who then became the impotence behind it. So if you reflect back on how the role of women often functioned in the late 19th century, she would not really have had the social and political clout to be the actual founder of an organization like this, although she was largely the driving intellect and the driving energy support behind the establishment of the organization. Very early on, she's given the almost permanent role of vice president of the organization, a role which she holds for almost a decade. And she brings in many of her friends from her elite circle to be guest speakers. We had attempted a few years ago to get a historical marker from the Pennsylvania Historic and Museum Commission for Tacony Library that was to celebrate M. Louise Thomas. She is a very significant woman of history, and among the things that she is noted for, she was personal friends with Abraham Lincoln. She was personal friends with Lucretia Mott, with Susan B. Anthony, with P.T. Barnum, and she also was noted on the international circuit as a woman of letters and literature. A number of her letters were published internationally. She was recognized in Europe as a distinguished speaker and leader, and she was one of the founding leaders of an organization called Cirrhosis. And Cirrhosis was an organization for professional women, and she was very much an advocate for women taking on roles in business. And while her husband, Abel C. Thomas, was a Unitarian Universalist pastor, she ran the family business, which was a family farm where she raised cattle and she grew all manner of crops. She wrote, she collected artifacts. She was a distinguished speaker. And just one thing that she accomplished was her impetus behind the Keystone Scientific and Literary Association. So it's interesting to note that very early on, she was approached to bring in guest speakers. And it was announced at one of the first presentations that the organization held that an upcoming speaker would be P.T. Barnum. We don't know exactly what date he came to speak, but we know that when he spoke on the subject of temperance. He was a recovering alcoholic, and he frequently spoke on the subject of temperance, and he spoke at the Washington House. The Washington House was a hotel that was located down by the river, and it was featured very prominently during the Tacony era of William Gatzmer. It was a destination for people who would come up the river for leisure from Center City, Philadelphia, to get away from the heat in the summer, and they would spend the time at the Washington House. It was about 200 yards from the river, had a boat launch there, and lots of recreational facilities, a tree grove, and a large outdoor porch that was particularly noted as a lovely place to eat strawberries and ice cream. So the Washington House hosted P.T. Barnum when he came to speak. The crowd was such that they overflowed out of the building, and it had to be taken out into the field where he spoke. So he was one of the major speakers that M. Louise Thomas had arranged to come to the Keystone Scientific and Literary Association. They had a number of interesting occasions that took place with some of their guest speakers. They also did a lot of debates and what they refer to as entertainments. And entertainment was an opportunity for people from the community to do poetry readings, to play musical instruments, to sing, and to read from literature. And at one of these debates that they had, forgive me while I flip through my notes to find it. At one of the debates that they had, there was a huge discussion about, I'm sorry, I just have to find it. It was a discussion on the subject of temperance. I'm going to read directly from my notes to you on this. On May 2nd, 1877, a public lecture on temperance was delivered by the Reverend T.W. Mallory. The topic was of such interest that the space was crammed to its utmost capacity, with quite a number being unable to secure seats. Dr. Augustus Zeitler regarded this lecture of great importance, for when he was recording the minutes of the association, he recorded the minutes in great detail. The speaker likened temperance to the Reformation and called for, quotes, the reform of the drunkard to, quotes, the virtues and light of the gospel. He cited an example from Delaware 40 years previously, where the citizens worked with the Whig and Know Nothing parties to elect a temperance-friendly legislature, but something like a liquor lobby managed to get their candidates elected in the next term, and thereby they repealed all the temperance laws. Mallory stated that the lesson that was to be learned from this was not to trust temperance to politicians and legislation, because politicians can be swayed by money, and, quotes, they will always betray us. The remedy, he said, was for professing Christians and church members to live their faith without hypocrisy towards liquor and entrust the matter to God through prayer. He made reference to something that was happening in Chester and proclaimed, quotes, the hand of God was present in this glorious work, providing the example of a man who had renounced selling whiskey and was now following a, quotes, respectable plan of life. The minutes record that most of the audience was attentive and appreciative to this lecture. However, there were, quotes, one or two uncultured individuals whose mocking and loud conversation was annoying to the ladies and gentlemen, as it was insulting to the guest speaker. The Frankfurt Gazette felt prompted to write an article about the evening, advocating that a future lecture should be held on the subject of how to behave. So, lest anybody think that snark and rudeness was not something that people did in the Victorian era. No, people could get really, really cantankerous at meetings then. So we see in this next picture, this is the Henry W. Dittman Consolidated School. And when we say consolidated, it's because these two separate buildings were consolidated to make one school. And then here we see the headline from the date when M. Louise Thomas gave her historic speech at the celebration of the 4th anniversary of the Diston Library, which actually was the 12th anniversary of the Keystone Scientific and Literary Association. And this was held at the Tacony Music Hall. There were a number of interesting instances in reading through the minutes of the association where the secretary inserted their own opinions of things. Like I had already mentioned that obviously Dr. Augustus Zeitler was very interested in the content of that speech on temperance. He also inserted his beliefs and preferences further into the recording of the legacy of the organization, where he commented on the gift of a handsomely bound Bible that had been donated by George W. Childs, the co-owner of the Philadelphia Public Ledger, and a personal friend of Anthony Drexel and Ulysses S. Grant. And he related in there that this book should be a guide to nurture us in its constant use and lead us to heaven if we obey its precepts, which is very interesting to reflect upon how that sort of failure to separate church and state and religious bias would not be found in a public library of even the 20th century, much less the 21st century. So a very interesting discrepancy of how that worked its way in during the 1870s and 1880s. Another instance where there was some heated debate, on September 11th, 1877, the Young People's Association of Tacony had dissolved. Now, back in February of 1877, they had donated a significant sum of money that they had gathered from a fundraiser to help establish the library. At that time, it was $40.50, which was a considerable amount of money in the 1870s. And as a reward for doing this fundraiser and making this donation, it was determined that the boys that were members of the Young People's Association of Tacony would be given discounted memberships in the Keystone Scientific and Literary Association and be permitted to actually use the materials. This is interesting because in this day and age, the idea of a library is that children should be able to have access to it, and that teenagers particularly might need to have access to it for doing schoolwork. But at this particular time and place, the rights of children and the rights of access of children to materials like this was not something that was considered. So there was a very, very heated debate as to whether or not these boys, once the organization they were members of had dissolved, if they should have any right to continue to have access to the materials that they were gathering in the Literary Association library. The Adventures of Mr. Obadiah Oldbuck. This was a book that was featured at one of the meetings of the Keystone Scientific and Literary Association. It is the very first comic book printed in the United States, and it was a highlight of the meeting on January 15th, 1878. Fred H. Womroth brought for exhibition a copy of The Adventures of Mr. Obadiah Oldbuck, which is an English translation of Les Amours de Monsieur Verbois, or Histoire de Monsieur Verbois, originally published in Geneva, Switzerland in 1837, and first printed in America in 1844. The presence of a comic book, referenced in the minutes as a comique, drew, quotes, a group of boys around the door. And Mr. Womroth is recorded as having stated that the artwork had, quote, been wrought out on paper with India ink by a lad who had never taken a drawing lesson in his life. So circling back to that whole thing about children being allowed to have access to the collection in this nascent library, the very fact that having a comic book drew a bunch of boys that hung around the door wanting to have an opportunity to see it is really quite amusing when you think about how in any day, even back in the 1870s, the presence of a comic book would bring children running, but that they weren't allowed to get anywhere near it at that time because that was not a child's place. So the history of the Keystone Scientific and Literary Association continued on for a number of years, following basically the pattern of important people being brought in to speak, debates, entertainments that involve poetry readings, music recitals, lectures, and assorted presentations on different topics. Another one of the topics that a speaker came to speak on, for instance, was on the subject of astronomy. However, from its inception, the Keystone Scientific and Literary Association suffered from problems with finances. One of the things that anybody who knows libraries know is that they do not generate revenue, they just spend money. The purpose of a library is never to generate revenue. So since the way this organization had set up its reading room and lending library was based on dues paying members, the only revenue that it generated was either from overdue fines, lost book fines, or from the membership dues of members. So even though they eventually had a very healthy number of members, they constantly had a struggle with revenue. And many of the books that were added to the collection, they weren't able to add because of purchase. they added because of generosity and donation. And in reality, a tremendous amount of the association's efforts was floated by the Diston family. So much so that eventually that's why the library changed its name and became the Diston Free Library and Public Reading Room. However, I'm going to go back again to, I believe, my M. Louise Thomas notes, because she points out that such was the great enthusiasm of people in Tacony in the 1880s that they initially decided that they were going to dissolve the Keystone Scientific and Literary Association in 1883. And they went to the US government and they made an application. And I'm going to get my other book, which begins the second volume of the association's minutes. So herein, we find on January 1st, 1884, this is the reconstituted Keystone Scientific and Literary Association, now known as the Tacony Library and Literary Association. They appealed to the federal government and they were given a US government charter. They also were given an official seal, which you see on the second half of this slide presentation. You can just see the embossment that is made into the paper. And the original leadership is Thomas S. Diston, M. Louise Thomas, Sorrel Pearson, John D. Griffith, Charles F. Gravitz, John H. Currier, and Zachary Taylor Gish. And the intent at the time, which M. Louise Thomas expresses in her speech in 1888, is that because of the way that they saw Tacony growing and their expectations for what was going to happen over the course of the next 20 to 30 years in the community, was that the center of industrial Philadelphia would completely shift up the river and be centered in Tacony. With that shift of industry up the river into Tacony, culture would shift along with it. And they anticipated that this new Tacony Library and Literary Association would form the basis of what would become the central library of the city of Philadelphia. And that the reason why they needed to get this charter was because they anticipated that it would eventually grow to such size and such recognition that it would be internationally recognized, and therefore having this federal charter was going to be important for it. So it's very fascinating to think that the level of optimism that ran so high in Tacony in the 1880s, that was where they felt that their growth was projecting onto, that they would have that kind of influence. Regrettably, the financial troubles of the organization continued. And by 1884, they were having more financial trouble than they were having previously. In fact, in 1884, it became necessary for them to run an audit where it was determined that they were $142 short in their budget. So they had outstanding debt that they had been unable to pay. And as a result, the corresponding secretary of the time was sanctioned by the organization and held responsible for this mismanagement of funds. And it's very interesting to read in the minutes how many weeks go by of the corresponding secretary actually trying to push off meetings about this and wanting to defer the discussion for another time until finally the audit was complete and they basically had to lay down the hammer with the corresponding secretary. So why have I included spittoons? They had spittoons, among other things, that they had to purchase as supplies for the library and reading room. And it's interesting to read in the minutes some of the things that they are authorizing for purchase. For instance, at one point in the wintertime, because it was so cold, they allocated funds for 1/2 ton of coal for coal burning stoves to keep the library warm so that when people came in, they would be able to sit and read in comfort. And the coal was purchased from the Distons. There's other places that talk about how much money they spent on oil, and oil was for lighting so that people would have light to read by. And they also provided spittoons because it was very common in the 19th century to chew tobacco. And spittoons were practically ubiquitous at that time. And so it's just very interesting to read in the minutes about money being allocated for something like this, and to think about how, well, you would never expect to see something like that in a library today. So being mindful of the time, I'm going to move ahead to the beginning of the 20th century. As the Keystone Scientific and Literary Association, now the Tacony Library and Literary Association, aka Diston Library and Reading Room, moved into the 20th century, their financial troubles were unescapable. So it became apparent that they were going to need to find some permanent source of funding, and that a permanent source of funding would be better supported by a tax rather than membership dues. So they made the decision to merge into the nascent Free Library of Philadelphia. And that decision was made in 1901. However, Jacob Diston wanted to donate land for the new building to be constructed on. And he reached out on February 27th, 1903, to offer a plot of land at the corner of Norr and Torresdale for the new building to be constructed upon. And that apparently was ignored. And it's left to deduce that perhaps it was ignored because his letter was written in longhand. So he tried again on June 2nd, 1904, and wrote the same letter again, only this time it was typed. We beg to offer the tract of ground situate on the west side of Torresdale Avenue at the south corner of North Street in Tacony, having a frontage on Torresdale Avenue. And this time his offer was accepted. So here we actually see an image of the deed and the cover letter that accompanied the deed when the land transitioned from the Tacony Trust Company over to the city of Philadelphia for that plot of land. These documents are in closed reference in the Neighborhood Library Services Division office of the Free Library of Philadelphia down at Parkway Central at 1901 Vine. So I was able to go in there and go through the files and collect images of this documentation. So I also have this is the speech that was delivered on January 6, 1906 by Mr. J.G. Rosengarten, who was then president of the Free Library of Philadelphia, at the dedication of the cornerstone of Tacony Library. And here he says, "We are met to lay the cornerstone of a new branch of the Free Library. Tacony and all its busy neighbors may well join the city and the Free Library in returning thanks to Mr. Jacob S. Diston for the gift of the beautiful site for this new branch. It assists the wisdom of the magnificent gift of Mr. Andrew Carnegie, providing for 30 branch library buildings to increase and extend the work of the Free Library of Philadelphia. Mr. Diston has joined the other generous benefactors, and foremost among them are the great other industrial establishments, the pride and boast of this city, the Baldwin Locomotive Works and the Pencoid Iron Works. Not only have the Diston Saw Works carried their name far and wide, but here the thriving industry is accompanied by good homes and good schools and good churches, and now a good free library building will soon open its doors and offer the use of its books and its reading rooms and its lecture hall to the people of Tacony and the neighborhood. And here young and old can carry on their education from its books. Much as the city of Philadelphia has done for the free library as a means of education, it still rests on the citizens to increase its facilities by gifts of land such as this that Mr. Diston has given for the Tacony branch, and by a wise use of the great and growing store of books belonging to the free library and of the courses of lectures given in its library buildings to show that the people fully appreciate the opportunities of study and instruction and wholesome entertainment provided for them by the city of Philadelphia and by Mr. Carnegie's splendid gift and by that of Mr. Diston. What's very interesting in this speech is that the speaker makes no mention whatsoever of the background history of the Tacony Library, makes no mention of the Diston Reading Room, makes no mention of the Tacony Library and Literary Association, and no mention of the Keystone Scientific and Literary Association. He must have received negative feedback from that, because at the dedication later that year in November of 1906, he does make mention of it briefly. But some of that is an indication of just the extent to which that great power and vision in 1884 of what they expected the library in Tacony to become and how it became supplanted by the Free Library of Philadelphia, to speak of how the financial fortunes of the organization changed and impacted it so significantly.
No sound.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, we
Yes.
lost all the sound in the last part of
I'm
it.
trying to be mindful of the time. I'm watching my watch.
Check. That working? Check. Yeah. Okay. So thank you, Suzanne. It was fascinating. Yeah. So the way we do it is we alternate. We take a question via Zoom and then a question from the live audience. We'll start with the live audience. Yes, sir. Hold on. Let me. You have it? Oh.
Hello. What types of books were read from 1876 to 1900? Like, what was the most popular books read?
Oh, that's very interesting. A couple of the debates that they had in the early days of the Keystone Scientific and Literary Association had to do with the nature of books and whether or not fiction or nonfiction was the most beneficial thing to read. And at the time, fiction was considered to be not particularly beneficial and a good use of your time. So primarily the emphasis was on nonfiction. And with Tacony being a growing industrial area, a lot of the books that they purchased at that time supported people who were interested in industry and science, but also a lot of American history. So a number of the collections that they added specifically were history around the Civil War.
I don't see any. Can you switch to the chat? I don't see any questions. There were just a couple of comments about the sound. Okay. Anybody else have a question? I'm fat. Oh, yeah. What? Oh, so okay, yeah, we had a recording being played, a song, and I guess that didn't go out on the Zoom feed. So everybody out in Zoom, the reason you didn't hear anything was because that audio for that song portion didn't go out. But you're back live now. I have a question. So I'm just fascinated by this idea that they thought the people in Tacony thought like the whole center of Philadelphia culture was going to move to Tacony, because right at that time, City Hall was under construction, this massive, building that was going to tower over the center of the city. And people in Tacony really were thinking that everything was kind of going to move up there.
Everything was growing so rapidly. They did seriously anticipate that that growth was just going to continue and that the settlement would grow and the industry would grow. And with it, with all the new people coming in, that culture would grow right along with it. And if you remember at the time, an awful lot of the colonial buildings were still standing in Old City. And there was this view that the old part of the city was over 100 years old and that this was now the new city. And this was the trajectory that growth was going to go in. So they were installing things that were considered state of the art at the time: indoor plumbing, sewage systems. When it became available, electricity. Before that, there were gas lines that were submerged going into the houses. And of course, the Distons had a vision that Tacony was going to be a utopian society that people were going to want to emulate, and that it was modeled off of this idea of easy access to all of the things that make for good living. So they believed that that model was really just going to catch on and be completely transformative of the entire area.
Wow, interesting. Any other questions? No? Yes, ma'am. Hold on. Let me get you the microphone.
My question deals with this housing surrounding the Tacony Library. Was that there when that building was put up, Carnegie Building there?
That's a very interesting question. There is an urban legend that I can neither confirm nor deny that where Tacony Library currently stands, there were 4 twin houses that had been built probably about 50 years prior to the library. And those houses were lifted up and moved over to Van Dyke Street and still sit there today. I have never found anything to confirm nor deny it, but on old street maps, there are indeed 4 houses that are sitting there. The houses behind the library on Marsden Street were constructed in the 1880s. So yes, that area was already well developed by the time that plot of land was transformed into the library.
Okay, I think we have, here's a question online. Where, whoop, could you bring that back up?
I got it. Were there any famous speakers during that time? You did mention P.T. Barnum.
Yes, also Susan B. Anthony. She spoke again as somebody who was a direct contact of M. Louise Thomas. And I could dig through my notes and pull up some more people. Just as a, for instance, the Honorable John Robbins, who had been a former U.S. congressman and one-time Philadelphia mayoral candidate, was a donor of note to the Keystone Scientific and Literary Association, likely spoke along with his donation. And a number of people who were prominent in the Tacony-Frankfurt area were speakers. And in fact, the talks that the association offered were considered to be significant enough that they were able to prevail upon the Frankfurt Train Company to add an extra pickup and drop off so that people could stay through the entire programs, which usually let out after 10:30 at night, and still catch the train back to Frankfurt.
Two questions. Where did you say the original location was for the Literary Society? And is the building still there? Number two, why did they invite P.T. Barnum? As he was an entrepreneur and promoter. What did they expect he would contribute?
200 books.
Huh?
He donated 200 books.
What kind of book?
We don't know.
Oh.
Yeah. But that was what he contributed, was 200 books. So,
Where's the location?
okay, so here is the Dittman Consolidated School. Originally, the Keystone Scientific and Literary Association occupied a room in the Dittman Consolidated School. As the community grew and the school became more and more crowded, they eventually were asked very politely by T. Worcester Worrell to please find someplace else to go. And for months, they debated whether or not they should build a library, purchase another building, rent a building, but then they were unable to stay and continue to use that space for a time. They eventually moved into the Tacony Music Hall, and they occupied the upstairs level of the Tacony Music Hall for a number of years. Then they moved out of the Tacony Music Hall, and they moved across the street to the Tacony Land and Trust building, and they occupied a space in there. And eventually, as they were starting to really have serious financial troubles and were starting to really explore merging into the Free Library of Philadelphia, the Tacony Trust Association took over almost all of their assets and began to manage it for them. And there's a final page in the minutes that talks about how their assets were dissolved in 1906.
So I think you sort of answered these questions online here. Were there any notable guest speakers during this time, famous authors perhaps, but you sort of answered that, right?
Was the last question.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then where did the library, you sort of answered this one too. Where did the library books come from? Were they purchased or donated?
It's very interesting. Whereas today, the librarian would be responsible for making most of the purchases of books. There was a committee that actually made the purchases of books, and they would actually vote at the meetings of the association on what books they were going to purchase. And then they would empower these committees and subcommittees to go out and make the purchases. So, remember you're talking about 19th century sums of money. So they would be charged with like $10 to go out and purchase a set of books. And they would come back and they would review what the purchase was going to be. But really the bulk of the books were donated by M. Louise Thomas, were donated by the Distons, were donated by other leaders in the community. For instance, I mentioned the 200 books that were donated by P.T. Barnum. However, at its largest, the collection was over 2,500 books, but there were over 4,200 people who were active library users. They only would allow people to borrow one book at a time. You could only have it out for a week, and you had to pay an extra fee if you wanted to borrow a second book.
Was Thomas South involved in this at all?
Yes, he's mentioned in the minutes, and there's also mention of his wife dying from consumption.
Oh,
And she's the first member of the association who dies. So there's a significant discussion of her and her passing in the minutes.
yeah, he was a very prominent figure in Tacony at the time.
Yes.
Okay.
We have a question here. Before that, there had been an earlier request if you could run the slideshow again, but slower, which probably would
Well,
not be
it's
technically
not
right.
automatic. You have to advance it manually, right?
It's supposed to be automatic, but because it's attached to my PowerPoint, I
mean,
can advance it automatically.
It just went.
I mean,
maybe
I can
thought
advance
we're
it myself.
still doing some questions, maybe if you could just get there
Yeah.
again.
Well, the
but
other thing is he can go to,
But I was gonna say, you could all, whoever needed to see that again, and it went pretty fast here. You could go when it gets onto the YouTube channel.
yeah, we're
and you
going to
could take
put
a
it
look
on the
there.
YouTube
I
channel.
should explain what that slideshow was.
They were all.
So in 2016, we did a celebration of the 110th anniversary of the Tacony Library. And this was done in partnership with the Historical Society of Tacony. And for each decade, I put together a slideshow that had musical accompaniment that was a song that was recorded that year. So for that 1906 slideshow, that song was actually recorded in 1906. So it was pictures and images of things that were relevant in that year. So it was 1906, 1916, 1926, all the way up to 2016. And the way it worked is Lou Itrola from the Tacony Historical Society provided a narration, and then we would run that decade slideshow. And then he provided the narration for the next one, and we ran the slideshow. So it was a very fun evening celebration. And I just thought it'd be fun to tack that on as an end to the presentation of, let's listen to some music from 1906 and look at these images.
Okay, we have a question here.
The distant estate is, yes. So the distant estate is on the National Register of Historic Places. And it was the area that was set up by Mary Diston as part of the original housing development for the Diston Sawworks. And it is still to this day, that section of Tacony is dry.
Who did Carnegie hire as the architect to design the libraries?
Oh, Carnegie didn't care.
Well, who was the architect?
In this particular case,
All the Carnegie libraries kind of look the same.
well, that's the interesting thing is there's 3 different basic models to a Carnegie library. The ones when you think of are the all look the same is the famous Carnegie T. And in the Free Library of Philadelphia, the Tacony branch is the first one built following the Carnegie T model. The architect at the time was, oh, I had it written down. I believe it's Lindley Johnson. Yes, it was somebody local. The first 3 branches of the Free Library of Philadelphia that were built using Carnegie funds are the Frankfurt Avenue branch, which now doesn't look at all like a Carnegie library because it was so massively renovated in the 1950s, but it was a Carnegie, but it was a cube. Then there is the Lilia Marrero branch, which was the Lehigh Avenue branch at 6th and Lehigh. That's a Carnegie rectangle. And then Tacony was the first of the Carnegie T's, and it was followed shortly thereafter by Holmesburg, which is also a Carnegie T.
Do any of the books from the original library still exist?
I'm going to say yes, because one very important book definitely still exists. And that is the roll book that the staff used when anybody came in and registered for a library card. So you can actually go down to Tacony Library, access the historical collection, and you can look at the names and addresses of everybody who registered for library cards from 1906 to 1920 and see who lived where. And it's a great way to support genealogy research, because if you have the time and the inclination to want to go through that, you can corroborate that a family member did indeed live at a certain address, and you can see that perhaps they lived at the address in 1906, but then by 1917, they had moved to a different part of the community. Or you can see where their descendants have purchased other properties, and you can see people that follow the same name. So it's a great genealogical resource that is still available. We also have down there a anniversary book from 1917 from St. Leo's Church, which lists all the church members from 1917 and their addresses, which is also very useful for genealogical research.
Okay, oh, yes, sir. Maureen, where are you? Oh, yeah.
Is that cataloged? Is it in the local archives? That acronym, is it there? The archive that you're talking about in the library?
The things that are in the historical collection at Tacony Library, some of them are cataloged. They all are barcoded, so they should have catalog records. They may be challenging to search. It would be easier to search them if you worked with a librarian. You could either go to the library and work with the librarian there, or you could reach out to the Social Science and History collection down at the main library at 19th and Vine, because the librarians in that department know how to do deep dives into the library catalog and find specific historic records that may not be as easy to find as, you know, say a contemporary James Patterson novel, because you need to know what the right keywords are to go find it.
Okay, so thank you so much, Susan. That's really fascinating. Tacony is so historic and interesting. There's another facet of it. So a reminder to everybody, this is our last sort of lecture meeting for the year or the season. So we're going to meet at the GAR, Grand Army of the Republic Museum and Library on Frankfurt Avenue in Holmesburg on June 5th, I think is the first Wednesday. Then we take a break in July and August, and we'll meet back here in September. And again, the way we stay in touch with everybody is through our Facebook page or our email list. So if you haven't signed the sign-in sheet, please do so. And everybody is welcome to stay for refreshments and networking immediately after. Okay, thank you again, Susan. Right.